we spent a lot of time talking about selling and customer relations, and we did so because it's really important. It's almost as important as knowing all the stuff about the specific gear. You can know as much as you want about gear, but if you can't communicate that and bring that to the customer, it doesn't really matter. So we really want to focus on that, but we need to also focus on gear as well. And the whole point of this training video isn't to teach you, the specifics about this one shoe, because maybe this shoe doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. Who cares? What I want to teach you is the idea behind the shoes and the technology behind it, and why we want to size a shoe this way, and why downturn works, and how asymmetry works, and different closures of shoes, and why it's better for one foot versus another, so that as different shoes come out, you're going to be able to apply that basic knowledge and really have a deeper understanding of the shoe itself, almost more so than what you might just be able to read in a quick paragraph of that shoe. So, we're going to talk a lot about shoes because fit and all of that, it's really important, and there's a lot going on with that. We're going to talk about harnesses a little bit. We're going to talk about chalk. We'll even talk about chalk bags and brushes and a few other things that may seem really simple and nuanced, but there are some differences in it. And the more experience you have and knowledge, like I said, you can communicate with the customer, just the better we're going to be able to talk to them and sell stuff to them. Climbing shoes are really important for really the one aspect, and I would argue with anybody about this, that it's really the only piece of gear that you can buy that is climbing specific that can make you a better climber. Chalk might be a close second because we need friction to climb on our hands, and hands need to be dry and all that, but climbing shoes can make or break your climbing experience. And that's why we're going to spend a lot of time talking about fit and closures and different lasts and different shapes of shoes, because it can really take away from the experience of climbing, but it can also add so much more to it. And there's so many little nuances about how the shoes are made, about the different materials that they're made out of, that just contribute so much to the overall how it's going to work for the customer. So we're going to go through all of those, and like I said, we're going to touch on basics and general ideas of how shoes are going to work. Nothing really too specific. If you really don't know anything else about climbing shoes except for how to fit them, you're doing really good. Size matters, and it does because it can ruin the climbing shoe. It can completely make all that performance and that downturn that you paid for not really work. Or, if you get a beginner shoe that's too tight, they're a beginner. They're not going to want to climb in it. So really understanding how to size the shoe is almost all of the battle. And, everybody kind of talks about this idea of, and it's a really ambiguous one at that, of like how climbing shoes should fit. And everybody has this like really strong opinion. And maybe, it's like, yeah, you want this like as tight as you can get it, and it needs to be really, really tight and super snug, but not too snug. You don't want it to be too uncomfortable. And it just becomes this idea of like comfortableness, but really tight. And what does that mean? There's no real concrete like idea behind that. Everybody's different. What is painful to one person is comfortable to another. And something to kind of think about is that you climbed in a different size shoe when you first started than what you probably climb in now. And so you have to kind of walk the customer through that experience. And a beginner's not going to wear as tight of a shoe as somebody who has their third or fourth pair. And sometimes people just do. They want to wear socks with shoes. And so, you have to kind of flow with the customer and realize what's going to be best for them. And, you don't have to climb in the same type of shoe and fit the same way that, you don't have to fit your shoe the same way that they fit theirs. What you need to be able to do and realize that the perfect fit is different depending on the shoe, depending on the customer, and depending on their needs. That's how you fit a shoe. You fit it to the customer for what they need at the time that they're buying the shoe. Don't fit them for a shoe that they're gonna be wearing 2 years from now. Fit them for what they're gonna wear right now, because they're gonna be happy now. And if they're happy now, when they're unhappy with the shoe later, they're gonna come back to us to get the shoe that's gonna make them happy. So with this idea of like, you know, what's right for the customer and really paying attention to how they feel in the shoe, and you know, like we all have different pain tolerances. So the closest thing I've been able to find to being able to physically explain this very ambiguous idea of is the shoe comfortable or not, and like, you know, it's uncomfortable comfortableness, is using a pin. Because, you know, pins can hurt, they can be pokey, and pokey works. So the pin analogy is this. If I take this pin and I put, you know, a good amount of pressure, at a certain point, I'm gonna feel enough pressure that I'm gonna say, you know, that's not comfortable. I can hold it here, and I'm holding it here while I'm talking to you. It doesn't feel good. It's something that 20 minutes from now, I'm gonna really say, you know what, I'm really tired of that. I don't want that poking me anymore. But on the flip side, I can take that same pin and I can add, you know, maybe even a slight more pressure or a lot more pressure. I mean, like, no, that needs to stop right now. That's kind of how climbing shoes are, you know, and, you know, the more I did this, if I did this every single day, I might grow tolerant of it. And that's how climbing shoes are. You kind of grow tolerant of it. It's not that they're really getting more comfortable, it's just that you've learned to tolerate it. So, you know, a beginner climbers, you're not gonna push the pin as hard. But by the 4th, 5th pair, you know, you're poking it pretty hard, and they've built up calluses and they can handle all that pressure. So kind of think about that and use the pin analogy if you need to, because it really can be a very ambiguous idea that's kind of hard to grasp, especially for new climbers. We've talked about this idea of uncomfortable and too comfortable and how it's relative to the customer and what shoe they're trying on, and, you know, maybe how many shoes they've had. And so what we really need to understand is, why do we downsize? Why do we fit climbing shoes the way that they do? And really the whole idea of a climbing shoe, and why it is so important in climbing, and why it can be the one thing that makes you better, is that it's there to reduce the amount of space between your foot and the wall. It's that magical connection that your feet get with the climbing wall. It's going to allow you to edge on things that are smaller and pull on tinier and tinier holds, and it gives your foot support. So, but something you need to realize is that, like, a beginner isn't going to size a shoe the same that somebody that has had their 3rd or 4th shoe. And because of that, the shoes are actually designed specifically for certain types of people and certain types of fit. So a beginner shoe, for instance, you know, it's going to be flat lasted. It's going to be pretty symmetrical. It's going to actually, for the most part, mimic what your natural foot's going to look like. And it's going to be that first process to getting your foot into an actual climbing shoe and start getting into maybe something more aggressive. But a beginner shoe, you're going to see that a beginner's not going to downsize as much. They're not going to just cram their feet into the smallest shoe possible. And so the toe box is going to be a little bit shorter. It's not going to be as tall, and you'll see an example here in a little bit, because really a beginner shoe, there might just be like ever so slightly curled. Maybe they're barely touching the front of the shoe. Maybe they're still wearing socks. We definitely want them touching the front of the shoe. And we really just want them touching the front, or, you know, just ever so slightly curl, like just a little bit. And if they're comfortable with a little bit more than that, that's fine, but definitely don't push them beyond that, you know. And it's really important with a beginner shoe, because if you don't get them touching the front of the shoe, they're not going to be using that tip of the shoe where really all the power comes from. And, you know, the whole idea of a climbing shoe is to really just add a lot of support and be able to drive and push power off that big toe. And if they're not touching the front, then they're not going to be able to get leverage as they get onto smaller and smaller holds. And so maybe they start using this side where they do feel their foot. And if you watch beginner climbers, which you should because you probably just gave them orientations and whatnot, look at where they're using their feet. You know, sometimes they turn out sideways really awkwardly and, you know, they're standing on this side. But realistically, we want just right under the big toe and the heel. That's, you know, some advanced heel hooks and stuff like that, top of the toe for toe hooking, whatever, etc. 90% of the time, right under the big toe. So if you're not at least touching the front of the shoe, you're gonna lose that power. And especially depending on the materials of the shoe, you wanna have a slight curl in it because it might stretch a little bit and that's gonna maintain a little bit better fit in the shoe. So looking at shoes that are more for an intermediate climber or an aggressive climber or somebody that's looking for an aggressive shoe, they're going to be shaped a little bit differently. So let's find some examples of, and this one shoe still exists. So actually, we're going to bring it back. This is a really good shoe for like a second pair of shoes or somebody that's looking for a more comfortable aggressive shoe. And what you'll see is that the toe box is a little bit taller. It's a little bit more asymmetric, which we'll talk about. But a really good example of something like that is gonna be like this shoe. You can see where it's downturned and you can definitely see where the toe box is a little bit taller. And what this is really allowing you to do when you size it is really cram your feet down into there. This is gonna do a couple different things. And if you don't actually fit a shoe like this, that way, you're gonna lose performance because it's actually designed to be pretty tight on your foot and have little dead space all over. So if you allow the toe box to be a little bit loose and your foot not fit in there quite as tight and be curled down into it, odds are the rest of the shoe is not gonna work and it's not gonna fit. And you're gonna pay for a little bit more for these shoes, but you're gonna lose that performance from it. So it's really important that you size these properly. And this idea kind of works no matter if you're talking about an aggressive shoe or a beginner shoe. And we kind of hinted about how, you know, we need to be able to stand on smaller shoes and or smaller holds. And the idea of this is that if you're like nobody tenses up and spreads out, right? Like when you're driving off of like a really small foothold, you tense up and you curl up and you pull up. So if you have room to do that in a shoe, you're going to pull your toes back and you'll lose that leverage. You know, if you only have like that small of a hold to pull down on and you pull your toes back that much, you just lost that leverage and you're gonna skate right off the hold. And curved shapes are a lot stronger too. So having your toes curled down into the shoe, it kind of helps prevent them from bending. You know, if your toe bends on a hold, your heel's gonna drop and you're gonna leverage your foot off the hold. But if it's harder to do that, you're gonna drive down and when you push, you're gonna get more power and more drive off of the foothold, which is what allows you to actually climb better in a shoe that's tighter and more aggressive. And it's that whole idea of what a climbing shoe is really for. And you can explain that to the customer, you know, it's a lot of people are not used to having a shoe that fits that tight. You know, we're kind of always, we're raised as kids to, you know, always make sure we have growing room and like you really don't want to be touching the front. And running shoes and hiking shoes, they fit completely opposite. Like everything that we know about shoes and how we fit them is completely wrong when it comes to climbing shoes. So customers are going to be bringing that experience and that idea when they start trying on their first shoes. And we have to kind of remold them and what their thinking is and change it for what a climbing shoe should be. When you're talking to a customer and they're a beginner, you're going to spend a little bit more time explaining all these concepts to them and, you know, kind of opening their eyes to why we size certain shoes different ways. Little side tangent real quick. You know, when you're planting those seeds that we talked about earlier and you're telling people about like, yeah, you should really think about buying your own shoes and all that, something that we really don't do a lot is take the time to actually properly fit somebody in rental shoes. Yeah, they're going to be wearing socks, and that defeats the whole purpose of what we talked about with, reducing the amount of space between you and the rock. And that's fine. Rental shoes are gross. Wear socks with them, but maybe start opening their eyes to that idea of downsizing and getting the shoe to be a little bit tighter, so that they're ready for that when they buy new shoes. But beginners you're going to have to kind of sway them into the idea of tighter fitting shoes. We don't want to push them into it though. Whenever you get to somebody that has had their third or fourth shoe and they're starting to look at more aggressive shoes, the nice thing is that they're going to already be kind of ready for that concept of wearing a tighter fitting shoe, and they're going to be more open-minded to it. The beginner, they're going to be a little bit more timid to jump into that, and that's fine. But one thing we never, ever want to do is convince somebody to go into a shoe that is too tight for what they want. We talked about let them make the choice and do that. It's not going to hinder your climbing or even affect it in any way if a customer wants a shoe that's too big for them. Even if mentally in your head you're like, no, it needs to be tighter. It doesn't. It needs to be the shoe that the customer wants, not the shoe you want them to be in. And because, like I said, we've touched on this idea, but I cannot emphasize this enough, that if we sell them the wrong thing, they're not going to enjoy climbing. They're not going to enjoy their experience. They're out money, we're out a customer, and we've kind of ruined the rest of the experience here at this gym for them. And not only did we lose a customer for retail, we might have lost a member. And then that just takes down our community, and it goes against everything we're trying to do here. So sell for the customer, don't sell for the shoe. As good as we can strive to be about sizing the shoe properly and making sure we have the right fit, right when the customer first buys the shoe, there's really some variables that we can try to account for, but they're still kind of random, and really only with just experience and follow up with the customer and paying attention to your own shoes that you've owned, and are you really going to start to understand these variables a little bit more to where you might be able to guess them a little bit. These are going to be things like, what is the material of the shoe made out of? How much does the person sweat? How often are they climbing? Where are they storing the shoe? How much do they downsize the shoe? All of these things are going to affect how much the shoe actually stretches and breaks in. And it's going to be 100% different from every customer and every shoe for that same customer. So like I said, you kind of extrapolate that out. It's a lot of variables. So let's talk about the most common one first, and that's going to be material. So a shoe can be made out of leather. A shoe could be made out of synthetics. And probably from this video, I grabbed two different shoes, and the second one's synthetic, the first one's leather, but you probably can't tell just by looking. Some shoes you can tell by feeling, but realistically this is where you're just gonna have to go beyond this video and research the different shoes that we carry at your location and really know more about the product. Leather is going to stretch a little bit more. There's something called lined leather, and that's gonna have a cotton or something on the inside. It's gonna stretch a little bit less, and synthetics are gonna stretch the least. A lot of times leather is really nice because you can downsize a little bit more. It will break in and stretch and kind of conform to your foot, which is nice. And it's really good for beginners because, realistically you can tell them that the first time that they wear that shoe, it's probably gonna be the most uncomfortable it ever will be. It's only gonna get more comfortable. Lined leather kind of helps reduce the amount of that stretch. But leather kind of has this unknown variable of how much is it going to stretch. And the more you sweat, the more that leather is going to stretch. And the more you sweat, the synthetic will stretch a little bit, but not as much. But synthetic does stretch the least. It has the most consistency out of fit. And so that's why on some of the higher performing shoes, you're going to see that in the toe box area, at least the toe box, if not the whole shoe, because you don't want a high-end shoe to stretch. You really want to know what it's going to feel like a few months from now, because that person's probably climbing more often. And because of the performance, if it gets too big, we already talked about how you lose the performance of the shoe. And so you'll see a lot of synthetics in there. That's not to say you won't see leather in high-end shoes, you might. I think as of right now, when this video is made, the industry is turning away from that, but you'll still see it from time to time, and maybe it made a resurgence. But this is where knowing these ideas and concepts of how shoes are made and stuff like that is really gonna help you understand some things. So keep materials in mind, inform the customer of that. It's just something that they kind of need to take into consideration, and you do as well, because remember, they're coming to us for our expertise. So other than materials, which that's a really big one, probably half of shoe stretch and all that is really gonna be affected by materials, but the other half is gonna be affected by things like sweating, which we kind of hinted at, where you're storing the shoe, how often you're climbing. So, you know, somebody that's not climbing, but maybe once a week, once every other week, that shoe's probably not gonna stretch as much, or it'll just take a lot longer to break in, but they're probably not climbing enough really to put a lot of pressure on that shoe, and it'll probably maintain its shape pretty well. You know, things like where you store the shoe, like we're in Texas, or at least when this video was made, all of our locations are in Texas. And it gets really hot here. And that's really, you should not ever store a shoe in a hot car in the summer, and really shouldn't store it in a cool, you should keep it climate controlled. Carry it with you at all times. You never know when you want to climb. But it can be really bad on the shoe, and it'll actually cause it to shrink a little bit, and a bunch of other things, but it'll cause it not to stretch as much. So things like that, and even sweating. The more the person sweats, or the more they keep the shoe on while they're climbing, can affect things like that. You're putting more pressure on the material. You're allowing it to stretch out more when you sweat into it more. So these are just questions that you should be asking the customer, and let them know that there's other variables, just so that they have a more realistic idea. You know, a really good story that I have is, I used to work with this guy that me and him bought the same shoe. He bought his a half size smaller, but we actually had the same size foot. Like if it was a running shoe or a hiking shoe or whatever, like we wore the same size. He just was more comfortable in a tighter shoe. But because the shoe was leather, it was a downturned all leather shoe, but he sweats a lot. Like his feet sweated profusely, where mine might get a little damp, especially in the summertime, but they don't like sweat a lot. It's not like puddles of sweat. And so by the time like me and him both kind of wore these shoes out, we kind of compared them, and his were like almost a half size to like 3/4 of a size bigger than mine, because he downsized them more, he sweated a lot, he just put that much pressure on the shoe. Now, this example is not to say that every shoe is going to do that when you downsize it a lot. That example is there to show you the amount of variables and what that cause and effect can be, and that there is an unknown. So keep that in consideration. These are just tools that we want to use to inform the customer. You know, there is some variables that it's hard to account for. So just setting up expectations for the customer is really what this whole point is. We've talked a lot about these kind of abstract ideas and stuff like that, but let's really start getting down to the specifics of the different shoes. I want to start with closure systems. At the end of the day, the shoe has to stay on your foot to work. So, I mean, it might sound obvious, but so there's really 3 different ways that companies approach closure systems. The longest standing one, and I think it's probably the second most common. It's definitely more common in beginners and in shoes, and it starts to become a little bit less common, I think, in aggressive shoes, but that's gonna be lace-ups. Pretty simple. It explains itself. It's a lace-up. It's gonna allow the widest opening. It's gonna allow the most adjustability, which is why it's always nice to have a lace-up version in a beginner shoe. It'll fit a narrow foot, it'll fit a wide foot. Especially if the laces go further down to the toe box. You can accommodate so many different size shoes. It is a little bit harder to get on, so I think as you get into aggressive shoes, you start to see it less and less because you want to be able to get those on quickly, get them off quickly. People wearing aggressive shoes tend to not wear them around the gym. They only wear them when they're climbing. And beginners sometimes don't realize that they can pop their shoes on and off. So, you know, beginners tend to be more okay with laces than people that are buying aggressive shoes, but lace-up aggressive shoes still have their place in a good lineup. The next one, and I think it's probably gonna be the most common, is gonna be Velcro. You're gonna have shoes that have 2 straps of Velcro. You're gonna have shoes that have 3 straps of Velcro, and you know, the further it goes down, the more adjustability it has. But I think this is a good blend of adjustability and ease of entry. You know, it's just, you pop your foot in there, it's quick, it's easy. So, you know, embrace the Velcro. Some people associate it with like old man shoes or whatever, but they have their place in climbing for sure. Then you have shoes that they're kind of this gray area. They have one Velcro strap up here. I don't really think of these shoes as being Velcro. The Velcro is there to really help the shoe stay on during certain things like heel hooks and whatnot, and just to allow a snugness of the shoe, just to really cinch it down. But it doesn't actually do anything. If the toe box doesn't fit, it doesn't matter. This can't do anything to make this fit. So really, fit is really important in this type of shoe because there's no adjustability to it. So fit it right. Then you have the very obvious slipper. That's gonna be something like this, that there's no adjustability to it. You fit it, you don't, there's no in between. Now, this is starting to become less and less common because they're hard to fit. You fit it, you don't. If you create a shoe that doesn't have a good fit for most people, it's just not gonna work. So yeah, you don't see this too often, but it still has its place. Some people like it. Something to note though on these and all the different closure systems is that they're not actually unique to a beginner shoe or an aggressive shoe. It's unique to what the shoe is supposed to do for that particular customer. And so something to kind of think about, but it's really, we want to think about closure systems in the sense of why would we want to put a customer in that shoe? You know, we talk about Velcro being the most common, and it is, but sometimes like if you look down and you see, you know, that you see a customer and they're having to crank the shoe over like that. You see how like all this folded material and everything? Let's say they actually fit. Lengthwise, they fit the shoe. That's great. But if they're having to do this, the shoe's too wide, the shoe has too much material for them. They probably have a wide shoe or a wide foot, and it's not really fitting side to side. And there's a lot of volume. And this is gonna be uncomfortable. I mean, could you imagine like as you step into that and all that? Like it's not, just don't do that. If you see somebody having to do that, it's a bad shoe for them. And you're gonna wanna put that person into a lace up where they can kind of cinch up all that material and there's more play in it. So, you know, we have different closures because it works for different feet. And that's another thing you just want to be paying attention to. We're really about to get to like the meat and potatoes of what the shoe really is. You know, all the real differences that make each shoe unique and the different combinations of things like downturn and asymmetry, rigidity of the shoe and the rubbers that they use. And so it's really important before I even go into some of that stuff that you really just understand the overall concept and some different terms that I'm going to be using. Last. This is literally the mold they build the shoe around. The last is something that they actually spend a lot of time on, and they have a different last for every different shoe that they build, and that's what they're wrapping the materials around, and it's what contributes to the different shape of the shoe. You know, some companies will have a few different shoes that use the same last, and this is usually something you can find on their website. So, if you particularly like one model of shoe from one brand, you might try and find another model that's built around the same last, and you might really enjoy that shoe as well. Rubber. Well, this one seems obvious. There are many types, but generally you could classify them as soft rubber or hard rubber. Symmetry. This refers to the bend in the shoe when looking from the top or bottom. It's noticeable when looking at the tip of the toe box in relation to where the heel is. The more asymmetric the shoe is, generally the more aggressive it's going to be. Beginner shoes are going to tend to be a little bit more symmetric, and this is going to mimic more of your natural foot, whereas an asymmetric shoe is going to be a little bit more unnatural. And it's one of those things that when you see people kind of hobbling around on the sides of their feet, usually it's the asymmetry of the shoe that makes that actually more of a natural thing to do. Downturn. The amount of bend in the shoe when looking from the side. Downturn allows you to better pull with your feet on overhanging climbs, and not all downturn shoes are actually aggressive, but not all aggressive shoes are downturned. When referring to downturn, it might just be in the tip of the shoe, maybe it's all the way through the shoe, but it still all works the same. Midsole. The material between the outsole and the footbed of the shoe. How thick and what material manufacturers use in the midsole has a huge impact on how stiff or soft the overall feel of the shoe is. Some manufacturers will actually just completely disregard the midsole, and that will make for an incredibly soft and sensitive shoe. Outsole. The rubber on the bottom of the shoe. This can vary in thickness, and this is literally what you see when you look at the bottom of the shoe. The outsole can be a quarter outsole that's really just in the toe box area, and then you have the heel, or it can run all the way through. There's going to be different ways to do the outsole. Rand. The rand is something that, it's really the rubber that runs all the way around the shoe on the sides of it. And this is really what they're connecting like the outsole and the heel and everything else to. The rand doesn't have a huge amount of importance in the shoe in terms of performance. More so, this is something you want to pay attention to when customers are worrying about things like when they should resole the shoe and whatnot. If this is something that interests you, I think it goes a little bit beyond what this video is trying to accomplish. So just look up randing in the shoes. Let's start with the most common shoe that we're going to sell here. Hands down, we'll sell way more of these, and that's a beginner shoe. Almost all beginner shoes are going to share a lot in common. Really the only thing that's going to make them different is going to be quality and the fit. Fit really is everything, and we've talked a lot about that. So hopefully the manufacturer nailed the last. It fits most people, and most people will find it really comfortable. But all beginner shoes are going to be flat. There's not going to be any downturn. There's not going to be, they're not going to be very asymmetric. They're going to mimic the natural foot shape really well. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of toe rubber, but that's kind of uncommon for a beginner shoe. And they're going to have a pretty low toe box because they're not meant to be downturned. Generally, they're going to have a little bit thicker of an outsole, and this is going to help the shoe last a little bit longer. Beginners might not have the best footwork, so it just makes the shoe a little bit more durable. They're also going to be a little bit on the stiffer side. They may not be the stiffest shoes out there, but they're definitely not going to be the softest shoe. The manufacturers do this because when you start out climbing and you're newer, you might not just have the muscles in your feet to really be able to handle standing and bearing that much body weight on a smaller foothold. It's just kind of unnatural, right? So by having a stiffer shoe, you can take some of the pressure off of it. It almost adds support for your foot. And so, like I said, most beginner shoes are going to share all of these things in common. What the change is going to be is how they fit. So we talked about beginner shoes, and they're pretty simple. There's not a whole lot going on with them. Really, it's just fit. But when we get into aggressive shoes, there's a lot going on. we have soft, we have stiff, we have downturned, we have asymmetric but flat-lasted shoes that are better for edging. So let's start breaking down some of these concepts and see like why we'd want one versus the other and why they're good. So first I'm going to talk about rubber, and that's literally just the rubber itself. I'm not talking about rigidity when I say soft versus stiff rubber. I'm talking about the actual rubber itself. And a stiff rubber is going to be good for edging. It's not going to be as grippy if you're not able to put all your body weight into it, but it's going to maintain its shape a lot more. So on really small edges and stuff like that, where you need to bear down a lot of body weight and it's a more vertical terrain usually, it's not going to deform as much. A soft rubber though is going to be the opposite. It's going to deform a little bit easier, and that's going to make it a little bit tackier and grippier. This is really useful when you're having to like smear, or you're not able to put like full body weight into stuff like on overhanging routes. Something to kind of take note of though is that a stiff rubber, if I weigh 200 pounds, what might be a stiff rubber for me is going to be extremely stiff for somebody that is 100 pounds. And what is a soft rubber for me at 200 pounds might be extremely stiff for somebody at 100 pounds. Side note, I don't actually weigh 200 pounds, but for analogy's sake, we'll say I do. So let's start talking about downturn. We kind of referenced downturn, the idea of like it's how much the shoe is bent when looking from a side-to-side angle. Like I said, not all aggressive shoes have to be downturned. You might have a more aggressive shoe that's meant for extreme edging, and because what downturn is for, you don't need that, because extreme edging, you're usually going to be on more vertical terrain. What downturn is really good at is it's allowing you to hook into a hold on overhanging climbs and allowing you to pull with your hips and pull yourself into the wall. This is going to allow you to keep your hips and your butt closer into the wall. It allows you to weight your feet on overhanging routes more, which takes pressure off of your hands and arms. So it just allows you to better utilize your feet in an overhanging route. So we're going to talk about symmetry. I've hinted about it, I've kind of talked about it, and it's something a lot of people kind of don't think about. And symmetry of the shoe refers to where the toe is versus the heel. And this is a really good example because this is a highly asymmetric shoe. You can see the heel's over here, the toe's over here. It's really bent like that. What this does is it allows us to put a lot of weight down into the big toe of the shoe and makes the shoe more precise. We've already talked about the idea that that's where we want all the power to go, is over that big toe. But asymmetry is not really a comfortable thing. Whenever you see somebody kind of hobbling around on the side of the shoe, walking from one climb to another, it's because they're in a more asymmetric shoe. It causes the foot to roll out a little bit more, it opens up your hips. It creates for a more precise, powerful shoe. But it's definitely not comfortable. It's not something that even your first aggressive shoe, it probably isn't going to be super asymmetric. You're probably going to be looking for something more downturn, maybe slightly asymmetric, and then you'll move into something more asymmetric. It's not something that's really for everybody. One of the last things I kind of want to talk about, and for what we're talking about right now, is just the overall rigidity of a shoe. Really, when you get into more specific, higher performing shoes, you're going to start seeing soft and stiff shoes, and that's just like I'm saying, overall how bendy the shoe is. Stiff shoes are really good for edging. They're going to give you a whole platform in which to support your foot and really allow the transfer of weight down into that edge. Softer shoes, they're going to be more tacky, they're going to be more durable. You're going to be able to feel what you're actually stepping on, and you're really going to be able to feel the little nuances in what you're stepping on. Stiffer shoes though, whether it's downturn, stiff shoe, it's going to give you more of a platform in which to push off of. If you're outside climbing, really sharp holds might be kind of painful, so a stiffer shoe is really nice in that sense. But softer shoes, while they generally work really well in climbing gyms, you really have to have stronger foot muscles to kind of utilize it. If you don't, it's going to be a little bit harder to get all that weight and all that power into your toe. And then even beyond that, you have shoes like this that have like a half outsole. And yeah, while this shoe is soft, we have other ones like this that the toe box in this area right here, because of the midsole that they used, it's a really stiff shoe. And so, but it becomes softer back here. It conforms to the foot a little bit more. So it overall makes the shoe a little bit more comfortable, but it's still stiff here. Then we have shoes where the whole thing might be covered all the way back, and that's going to create a really stiff platform all the way through, that while the shoe might be downturned, you're still going to be able to edge really well on it. So you kind of see through all these concepts that they utilize all these different things to create unique shoes, because everybody climbs a little bit differently. They have different preferences. I personally don't really like stiff shoes. I know their place and I see their place and I understand why some customers like them, but my personal preference is towards soft shoes. I like to be able to feel what I'm stepping on. I like that sensitivity, but other people don't. They like to have that platform on which to drive off of and be able to edge really well and have maybe a little bit more well-rounded shoe. So once again, talk to the customer, see what they need, sell them the shoe that they want. Moving on from climbing shoes, we're going to start talking about climbing harnesses. And that every customer really needs one if they're going to climb on rope. They can't not wear it. And all harnesses, they're all rated to the same standard. A $200 harness or a $55 harness, it's going to hold up to the same amount of pressures that, fall factors and things of that nature. There might be subtle differences in comfort, durability, breathability, but they're all going to be able to take the same amount of falls and last relatively the same time under same use. So really what we want to focus on when it comes to a harness is making sure that it's the right fit for them first. So you have the belay loop, which is metal pretty much always goes on the belay loop. If you're tying in with a rope or sling or using slings for anchors or anything like that, it needs to go on these two points right here. Gear loops and everything should never really be clipped to. They're not load bearing. You have a haul loop back here that sometimes can handle some load, other times it can't. You're going to have things like adjustable leg loops or non-adjustable leg loops. But like I said, for the most part, harnesses are a harness. You're just going to get more comfortable, more slim, more lightweight. So that was a side tangent, but going back to fit, what we want is for that belay loop to be lined up in the center, to be kind of underneath the belly button. And what you'll see, and it's a really telltale sign of if a harness fits properly or not, is like sometimes you'll see the gear loops here on one of your hips. And then you'll see that it's cinched up pretty tight, it's properly tightened down, and the next gear loop is like way back here. That harness is too small for the customer. Yeah, it might work, but realistically, we need to get them into a proper size harness. It's not right for them. It's not gonna sit right on their hips or anything like that. And we really need to get it just properly situated. So, get them a bigger harness. We don't want to see something like that. We want to try and get this as closed down as possible. But on the flip side, if it's all the way tightened down and it's still kind of loose on them, the harness might be too big for them. And we need to get them down. So don't ever just assume the size. Have them try on two or three sizes. Make sure it's right. It takes a few seconds to try them on, and it really can make a difference. When talking about harnesses, this is a really easy thing to upsell, because most of you can probably think that you've had maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 shoes, but you've probably only had one harness, maybe 2 at most. Here in Texas, we don't climb outside enough. We don't have to tie in our locations. We don't put enough wear and tear on our harnesses that we're really blowing through them. More so people are gonna buy them because they want a newer one, or they want something that's a little bit more comfortable. So take the time to actually upsell this one, maybe sell them a little bit nicer one. It'll probably be a little bit more comfortable, and it's gonna be the last thing that they ever upgrade. So get them into something a little bit nicer. Talking about comfort, something that the climbing industry is moving away from in harnesses right now is like how padded the harnesses are. They used to just throw in as much padding as possible. And what they realized is that it's really more about weight distribution in the harness. And that the more material they have, not necessarily padded, but just surrounding you more, the more comfortable it can actually be. It used to be that the harnesses were really thick and bulky here in the back, and they're realizing that that's not really where you're getting all the pressure. You're getting it from the sides. So you start seeing where they're making the area that covers your hips a little bit wider, it cradles you a little bit more, and it creates for just a little bit more comfortable of a harness. So take the time, fit them, have them go hang in it if they need to, but really make sure that these fit properly, because we can't really take these back. We can take shoes back as long as they're in pretty good condition, but this is an absolute danger scenario if we take this back, because we don't know what happened to it. Fit it right the first time, because we probably have to throw this away if we take it back from a customer. We're really going to break it down and get down to some nuanced stuff now, and that's chalk. Almost every climber is going to use chalk. We need our hands to be dry to be able to hold on to the holds, and that's really what chalk is for. Some people will have the mentality of chalk is chalk is chalk, and for the most part that's true. It becomes a textural thing. Some people like chunky chalk, some people like a softer chalk, and that's fine. Really what it comes down to is some chalks are going to have drying agents, some are going to be a higher grade of chalk, and we just want to make sure we get the customer what their preference is. We try to carry a couple different price points, something for somebody that doesn't really care, all the way up to nicer chalks that might be pretty expensive, but they do make a difference. The chemical structure of the chalk is designed in such a way that it actually dries your hands out better than a cheaper grade chalk, because it actually has more magnesium carbonate instead of calcium carbonate. And what this does is they bond to the water molecules, which your hands are producing because you're sweating, differently than like a cheaper chalk that might have a higher ratio of calcium carbonate. Maybe it's kind of a nuanced thing, maybe not. But like I said, we carry different ones because we want to make sure the customer has what they want. We've talked about all the gear. We've talked about shoes, harness, chalk. I don't really feel like I need to talk about chalk bags, but maybe be aware that there's buckets that are really good for bouldering, and then there's bags with belts that are really good for, in general climbing, for whether you're bouldering or rope climbing. But chalk bags do work better for rope climbing than buckets do. It would be awkward to carry a bucket around. But all of this is really because I want to talk to you about the gear package. The gear package is really important for us. Hopefully you already know it. Maybe you were a customer beforehand, you were a member, and we actually got you a gear package. And so you should already know the gear package is a really good thing. It ties in this idea of gear that we've been talking about, and it ties in this idea of turning a hobbyist into a climber and at that pivotal point. And the gear package is a really good segue for that. So we have two different gear packages. We have a bouldering gear package and we have a rope gear package. The rope one is going to be our main one. We're always going to want to try and sell that one because it's the most usable. It works well for bouldering because it has a chalk bag and shoes, but it works really good for rope because it gives you a harness. The bouldering one doesn't. And so the regular gear package or our rope package, that's going to come with a harness, shoes, chalk, and a chalk bag, and then a 1-month free membership. And we do lose a little bit of money, but that's all right. We want to get them into climbing. Like we said, they stay with us longer when they have gear and they're invested. We also have the bouldering package, which is going to be shoes, chalk bucket, a bigger thing of chalk to fill that bucket, and then a brush because everybody needs a brush. I'm not going to talk about brushes because you should know what they're used for. They're for brushing holds. But yeah, so, mention these gear packages, upsell the gear package, sell that little bit nicer harness. But remember that really all of this is we're trying to get customers gear that's going to make that experience better for them. That's what this whole idea is about. We're training you to help give them a better experience. So hopefully you learned a few things. And yeah, hope you enjoyed. You'll have to do it again, I'm sure, if you're here with us long enough.